Can you go into presenter mode for the... All right, great. I see people are introducing themselves in the chat. It seems like we have a very broad audience. I'll try to keep my remarks at a very high level, but still give enough details so that you have a good idea of what's expected from this COP in relation to the issue of the global stocktake, which is a major outcome expected this year. So next slide, please. In terms of the outline for my presentation, I want to touch on 5 main baskets of issues. Briefly look at some of the key design features of the Paris Agreement, which are highly relevant for the discussions that we'll be having on the GST at this COP. Give you guys an idea of what the Global Stocktake actually is, perhaps the most unsexy acronym that exists within the climate process. We'll talk a little bit about how the Global Stocktake process has been conducted, and we will look at what the priorities of CARICOM, what are the priorities of CARICOM for the GST as recently set out in a CARICOM ministerial statement that was delivered yesterday. And then finally, we're going to have a look at where we are now and specifically what is expected on the GST at COP28. So I have a quote here to just give sort of a very high level flavor from the president-designate, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, where he says that this COP must be a historic turning point in this critical decade for parties to seize the moment of the global stocktake, to raise their ambition, to unite, act, and deliver, to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal within reach while leaving no one behind. Next slide, please. So this is animated, so you're just going to have to click for me. So we're looking at some of the key design features, continue clicking, of the Paris Agreement that were important for small island developing states as well as least developed countries and many groups of countries going into those negotiations in 2015. So the fact that there are legally binding aspects of the agreement is key and was key in those discussions. Before the Paris Agreement existed, we were in more of a bottom-up world where we had the Kyoto Protocol in place, but the Kyoto Protocol only included specific commitments for a very small group of countries that were considered developed countries at the time. So it was really important to go into the Paris Agreement with an understanding that we want to have a legally binding agreement in place that would apply to all parties. There are still countries that will debate whether or not the Paris Agreement as a whole is a legally binding treaty, but it is very clear that there are specific legally binding commitments that are included in the agreement. So, and around those commitments, we needed to have a certain level of certainty in relation, for example, to the obligation to submit a nationally determined contribution, to maintain that nationally determined contribution, and to update that nationally determined contribution, which sets out really the core of the legally binding nature of the Paris Agreement, because nationally determined contributions contain the actions that parties want to take in order to comply with, in order to be able to attain the goals that are set out in that agreement. So we have some others around measurability, and that goes to the idea of specificity. It goes to the idea of being able to transparently understand the actions that parties have submitted, and this is contained in the context of the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement, universal application that I spoke to, a separate article dealing with loss and damage. Loss and damage was not included anywhere in the original convention or in the Kyoto Protocol. Compliance arrangements were also key, as well as an inclusion of the consideration of the special circumstances of SIDS. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on this issue of the ambition or ratchet up mechanism and what that means in the context of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So this links directly into the GST. And I have a quote here from the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC describing the GST as a tool which was to result in a roadmap and giving some elements of what should be included in this roadmap. pertaining to sector by sector and region by region, actor by actor guidance for the interventions that are needed in order to align with a resilient 1.5 degrees Celsius world, as well as the need for this roadmap to speak to further action and where that action might be required in a practical and usable way. The mandate for the GST is contained in Article 14. There are 3 key elements. The first is that it is a collective assessment that is thematically looking at the issues of mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, and support in the light of equity and the best available science. The second is that the first global stocktake will take place in 2023, and this is the global stocktake that we're in right now, which will conclude at this COP, and it will take place every 5 years. And the third key element of the mandate is that the GST outcome is meant to inform parties in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner their actions and support, as well as in enhancing international cooperation for climate action. Next slide, please. So this is a bit on the process that has been outlined, and I don't want to spend too long on this slide. The key things to understand here is that we've been in a 2-year-long process that started in 2021 and that is concluding this year, and that there are 3 phases to that process: an information collection and preparation phase, a technical assessment phase, as well as a consideration of outputs phase. We are now in the consideration of outputs phase. You might note that it's the phase that has been allocated the least amount of time. Maybe it wasn't the most practical choice to organize it in this way. We are rushing to the finish line to try to design political messages, to try to conclude the discussion on the roadmap that the executive secretary spoke of in order to come out with a robust outcome from this first GST. Next slide, please. And so how does the GST process equal an ambition mechanism of the Paris Agreement? So the idea is, and we started in 2018 with kind of a warm-up for the GST with a Talanoa dialogue that was supposed to result in delivery of new and updated NDCs in 2020. And from that basis, we head into the first GST concluding this year, which is supposed to result in new and enhanced updated NDCs in 2025. On the 5-year cycle, the next GST will begin in 2026 and conclude in 2028, and so on and so on, and result in revised NDCs in 2030. So the idea is every 5 years, there's an opportunity to conduct this collective assessment, an opportunity to take stock of where we are, what are the successes, what are the gaps, what are the lessons learned, what are the lessons learned, what are the tools that we need in order to improve our climate action in relation to the specific goals that are set out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Could you click for me? Dazan? Thanks. So, however, we do not have successive 5-year GST cycles in order to course correct. We know from the IPCC that according to the model mitigation pathways that they have designed, in order to have more than a 50% chance of limiting warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius, with no or limited overshoot, or even to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we have to assume immediate action that implies deep global greenhouse gas emissions reductions in this decade. So that means in order to have a fighting chance of staying within warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we actually need action within this decade out to 2030. It means that this GST is perhaps the only GST that matters for keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal on the table. It means that the next GST can help us to accelerate action. But if we miss the mark at this COP, we might as well kiss that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit goodbye. And that, of course, coming from the regions that are represented in this group, we know that this is a huge problem. Next slide, please. And so what have CARICOM ministers said about their expectations for the GST process? They've indicated that this GST must deliver on 4 key headline commitments. The pursuit of 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways for just, equitable, and accelerated transition. And this includes everything from setting targets for renewable energy, global targets on renewable energy and energy efficiency, calling for advanced economies to immediately phase out of fossil fuels. They've also called to accelerate progress and implementation on the global goal on adaptation. This will also be agreed at this COP. And there are agreed sectoral priority areas that have been put forward for adaptation by the Alliance of Small Island States that have been endorsed. Food, health, water are some of these. They've called for the GST outcome to ensure that we can operationalize and capitalize the loss and damage fund. So they want to ensure that we see a call for early capitalization of the loss and damage fund, for funding from all sources to be directed in that area. And they've also called for the delivery of transformational finance for 1.5 degrees Celsius agenda. And this includes everything from ensuring that there are investments flowing to small island developing states for their own transitions, as well as, importantly, for adaptation, because adaptation finance is lagging behind and we continue to experience the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So where are we now? So according to the IPCC, we know that every increment of warming will result in regional changes in, could you go back? Thank you. In mean climate and extremes, and that those changes will become more widespread and pronounced. And I don't want to stay too long on this slide, but this is a graphic representation of what these temperature limits mean. It may sound as if there's no real difference between a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit and a 2 degrees Celsius limit, but there is an extreme difference. At every 10th of degree of warming, we will be exposed to more and more risks in relation to heat, in relation to desertification, in relation to precipitation, and linked to flooding, linked to extreme events. So this GST will be consequential, extremely consequential, for the regional changes in mean and climate extremes that we are likely to experience in the future. And even if we miss the mark, because there are those who are saying, well, we have more time, if we have an overshoot of the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that lands us in a 2+ degree world, you can see here the types of impacts that we will be exposed to in that context. So an overshoot also has implications for loss and damage. It has implications for the extent to which vulnerable countries, the extent to which we have livable societies and viable economies, even on the premise that we may come back down later on. And so in terms of the actual process, we've completed the technical phase, the political phase is underway, but this question of actually being able to follow up on the GST outcome hangs in the balance. And in order to be able to ensure that we can have a consequential GST that keeps the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit in reach, what we need to see is a clear follow-up to this year's conclusion of the GST process. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. You can continue clicking this on. So obviously the expectations are high for an outcome that would be robust. But at this point, there is almost no agreement on any of the key issues under discussion. So this is just to give a flavor of what some of those issues are. On informing NDCs, parties are discussing calling for enhanced NDCs, a post-GST follow-up process, and a capacity building program to help countries to design their NDCs. On mitigation, a goal to triple renewable energy output and double energy efficiency, as well as a commitment to some type of fossil fuel phase out, is being discussed. On adaptation, parties are discussing high-level targets for implementing a global goal on adaptation. On loss and damage, the Alliance of Small Island States has called for the development of indicators for being able to measure loss and damage, and this is to be able to support countries to access funding from the Loss and Damage Fund once it is capitalized. And then finally, on finance and means of implementation, there is a bit of a back and forth discussion happening there on the relationship between the provision of finance and aligning financial flows with a low carbon development pathway. So there's a discussion on the reform of international financial institutions, as well as a discussion on how to follow up on promises that were made to double adaptation finance. So this is just a flavor of the range of issues that are going to be coming forward in a GST discussion at this COP. But as I said, there is precious little agreement on any of them and time is limited. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.